Everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is the, I think, 7th part in the entomology series. I was thinking about doing Odonata, or Odonata, some people say, this week, but I think I'm going to go with Orthoptera. I just kind of felt like covering it. So Orthoptera is the order that consists of grasshoppers, crickets, katydids, and wettas. And it's a very interesting order. One of the reasons why I kind of wanted to cover it is, one, when I think of insect anatomy, that's sort of what I go to, I think, because that's the first order that I learned about, and a lot of that is because if you look at the head and the mouth parts and just the overall anatomy, Orthoptera is a great example of an insect. It's just a really good boilerplate kind of physicality to sort of learn what an insect is and how they're built and how they're structured. Same thing, if you look at a lot of texts, if you look at a lot of books that cover insect anatomy, that's sort of what they go for. You'll see an outline of usually a short-horned grasshopper. That's most of the time what they go for. And for whatever reason, it's just very useful in that sense. In some respects, I think it should have been covered immediately after the Big Five, but, you know, this is what I was in the mood to talk about. So, Orthoptera means tooth, wing. So ortho, think about an orthodontist, and then ptera, like we've mentioned, literally every other order, means wing. So tooth wing. And this makes sense because if you look at a grasshopper or locust, or most of the members of Orthoptera, if you look at their wings when they're unfolded, when they're flying, and not all members have wings capable of flying, but if you do, look at the ones that are, they have 4 wings, and they're very jagged around the edges. And so it's a very reasonable term to describe them, because if you look at most other insects, they have relatively smooth outlines for their wings. Orthoptera is really the exception to that rule. They have sort of these peculiar serrated edges for their wings, and I'm not really sure what the evolutionary benefit is of that. Additionally, Orthoptera is polyphagous, so they eat a lot of different things, and that does not mean that there's a varied diet for all the different species. It just means that if you look at the entire order, there's a whole lot of different diets. For the most part, species tend to be a little bit more specialist. There's a few exceptions to that. Most notably, a lot of crickets. Crickets generally are the most polyphagous of all the orthopterans. They eat just everything. They eat meat, they eat scraps, they eat carrion, they eat plant material. Their diet is very broad, but they're kind of the exception. If you look at grasshoppers and locusts, they're strictly herbivorous. And then if you look at certain katydids and bush crickets and wettas, you see a lot more. I mean, there's still polyphagous members, but there's also kind of obligate predators. There's a video actually circling the internet that shows a kind of carnivorous bush cricket attacking a regular polyphagous cricket, and it's brutal. And you really see an interesting comparison there with the anatomy, because they're not that different. The overall structure and build, the way the jaws are shaped, everything about them is very, very similar. But in terms of scale, one is the predatory cricket is massive, and it's covered in these thorn-like projections all over its body, these spikes, and it's very colorful. And then you look at the cricket that it's eating, and it's very dull-colored, and its wings are smaller and more like little thin strips just over the thorax, very similar actually to earwig wings in that regard. The more flightless varieties of cricket, they just sort of have these leathery little folds over the thorax that don't really do much. And yeah, again, just looking at the anatomy, the similarities are so striking, and yet at the same time, there's also a lot of interesting differences between different species, different families, different genera. The most peculiar thing to me about Orthoptera is how much they have in common. I mean, if you look at a wetta, if you look at a bush cricket, if you look at a cave cricket, a Jerusalem cricket, a mole cricket, grasshoppers, locusts, etc., if you look at all of them, they're unmistakable what they are. like when you see them, you know exactly what they are. Compare that to Hymenoptera. The physiological differences between an ant and a vespid wasp, which is what people think of when they think of wasps, compare that to like a tachnid wasp or a variety of different kinds of bees. They seem so different. They're physiologically very diverse. And then beetles, again, as I mentioned in the beetle episode, they're the most diverse of all creatures. They number higher in actual sheer number of species than any other life form on the planet. And the biological diversity that goes with that is enormous. But Orthoptera, they have those very generic chewing mouth parts. You've got the labrum and the labium plates. You've got the maxillae, the two little I don't know what you would call them. They're mouth parts that sort of help to shove food in. When I was talking about roaches, I used that similar analogy with the Men in Black scene where he like devours Will Smith, and you see those mouth parts very clearly. That's kind of pretty much what orthopterans all have. There's not a huge difference between the mouth part of a obligate predator orthopteran and a purely herbivorous one. They're like the same mouths. Kind of bizarre. Then you look at the eyes, 2 compound eyes, 3 ocelli in the center. The antennae vary quite a bit, but in terms of actual shape, like they're just club-like antennae, the only difference is the length, which is why you've got longhorn and shorthorn grasshoppers. Yeah, so, I mean, very similar. You've got that very muscular pair of back legs, and that's sort of like the iconic, like how you know you're looking at an orthopteran, is those back legs that have that unique arch, and then just a massive quadricep muscle. That's one of the most characteristic traits of all orthopterans, is the capacity to just have this spring-loaded jump that they have, which in the ones that have fully developed wings can be used as a springboard to just take to flight immediately. It's really interesting how their anatomy has, it's been so effective. It almost reminds me of, there's a process in nature called canceriformication, where a lot of animals that we think of as crabs are not actually crabs. They're just, hermit crabs are a great example of that. It's just nature happens to really work well with that shape, that a lot of animals just evolve into that form without having any genetic relation to crabs at all. And that's because it just works really well. If you think about it, a carapace is very effective at keeping an animal protected. Claws are really great at manipulating their environment. Eye stalks that sort of go inward, a great way to protect your most sensitive way of sensory perception, your eyes. The mouth parts that are chewing, that are found in crabs, very useful for a diverse array of different foods. Where I'm going with this is it's a very useful shape for an animal to take. It's very versatile, and so a lot of animals take on that shape. Well, similarly, orthopterans, there's not a lot of variation in their anatomy because it just works really well. Being able to jump away from a predator works really well. For the females, having that long ovipositor works really well. By the way, that's how you sex orthopterans. It's very easy. You can do it at a glance. At the back end of all orthopterans, and many insects have this organ. It's called cerci. It's 2 little prongs on the back end. They function very similar to antennae. They're sensory organs. Well, if there's a third prong, if there's one in the middle, that means, a lot of people with the first glance, they think, oh, well, that means it's a dude, right? Nope. That's not what you think it is. It's an ovipositor. It's a little organ that allows them to deposit their eggs in specific settings. For example, your typical feeder cricket, their ovipositor is relatively short, and it's used to deposit eggs a certain depth in the soil just to protect it from predators and mold and being washed away in the rain and things like that. Well, they vary a great deal. Some katydids, they have massive horn-looking ovipositors that are kind of intimidating looking, and some people would think, oh my gosh, it's a stinger, and it's not. It's just for depositing eggs. That happens a lot with wasps too. A lot of the females will have ovipositors that are super long, like oh man, why can't I think of that? Well, there's a variety of different wasps, and most of them are parasitic, and the female has these long ovipositors that people think is a stinger, and they kill them because they think it's got some kind of 5-inch long stabbing thing, and it's really only harmful if you're a flippin' caterpillar. But similarly, you see that in a lot of orthopterans. They have the ovipositor in the females, and they vary a great deal. But other than that, they don't really change a whole lot. Most crickets, for example, Grillidae, that's the family for crickets, they have sort of useless wings, but they still rely on those powerful legs to jump away from prey or predators, and it also confuses predators. It's not something you expect to see. If you're a predator, you expect something to run from you. If it jumps like that, it kind of shakes you up and throws you off, and it's very effective at preventing further predation. I've actually seen that firsthand. It's amazing how it affects all animals. If a cricket jumps away from a spider, it confuses the spider. If a cricket jumps away from a dog, it'll confuse that as well. So it's a very useful technique to avoid predation, not just in the sense that you can get away from a predator quickly, but it also throws off their sense of what to expect from a prey animal, and as a result, they're less likely to pursue it. So, yeah, I'm thinking, like, what all else needs to be covered about orthopterans? One really interesting thing, I was going to cover that, is the difference between a locust and a grasshopper, because that's something that I find fascinating. Again, epigenetics is sort of like the new buzzword in biology anyway. It's kind of amazing, the difference between a locust and a grasshopper, because under normal circumstances, you can't tell the difference between a locust and a grasshopper. They're almost the same animal. You would have to know the taxonomic distribution of that animal in order to say that's hands down a locust. What's interesting about locusts, what differentiates them from grasshoppers, is under certain conditions, and those conditions involve touch. Whenever food becomes scarce, these locusts, if they're rubbing up against each other because they're congregated because there's a lack of food, a certain number of times, if their tympani, their hearing organ, which is located on their ear, if it's touched a certain number of times, it activates certain genes that are normally not activated, and it causes a physical transformation in these otherwise grasshopper-like animals, and it turns them into locusts. And what you end up with is they physiologically change, their color patterns change, etc. They get alternating generations where you have winged adults that give rise to hopping adults. In other words, it's bizarre what happens. It's astonishing how this evolved. And then you end up with locusts, and they're, sort of a natural disaster for human beings. Another interesting thing about locusts, that it's kind of a mystery, we actually had locusts in the United States, and they were something that people dreaded. And then one year, they just didn't turn up at all. And of course, locusts, because they're sort of a dormant species anyway, that is to say they're unmistakable in many respects in terms of their behavior and anatomy from most grasshoppers under normal circumstances, people just thought, oh, well, they're just not turning into locusts this year. And then years passed, and finally it just sort of fell out of the annals of history that we even had locusts. Nobody knows what happened. We had locusts, and now we don't. And for, like, our national economy, that's a good thing. But it's also kind of bizarre that we had a species of locust that just went extinct overnight with no one really noticing. And we don't know what happened. Was it because of the Dust Bowl? Was it because of they were just happened to be very weak to pesticides? Was there an animal that was introduced that was just sort of under our nose? Because people weren't exactly environmentalists during this time. This was like in the middle of the 19th century that this happened. Did some sort of introduced predator wipe them out and then go extinct itself? We don't know what happened. It's bizarre that we used to have locusts and now we don't. And on some level it's kind of a relief because they are such a nightmare for human beings. But it's also bizarre that something happened to them and it wasn't like we actively tried to drive them into extinction. Whatever happened, it was probably our fault and was probably accidental, which is just crazy to think about. So yeah, that covers everything for Orthoptera, I think. Like, share, subscribe, and keep asking questions. Bye.